coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I think the majority of Americans, they don't like thinking about people this way. They don't like talking about people this way. It makes them uncomfortable. And they just don't sit around. They don't have the time to sit around and be obsessed with race or color or whatever you want to call it in the way these people online are. I think this over and over again. And normal people of whatever color or background in America do not sit around and obsess about race in the way that these people do. But that may not matter because the people in charge are in charge and they will persecute anyone who disagrees.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the Publishers and Editors podcast here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the American Mind and the Claremont Review books. I am joined by Matthew Peterson, vice president of education, founding editor of the American Mind, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind, Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind. James is on a plane, I think on his way to Texas, so he will not be joining us this week. We always try to track the news cycle here a bit, talk about what's on people's minds, and bring some analysis to it. So we really could not avoid talking about immigration and the ongoing crisis at the border. We'll talk a little bit about the Second Amendment too, but both of these things indicate, I think, well, one thing we've known forever, which is Biden is a mediocre politician. I mean, that's always been true, but this seems malpractice on a pretty high order. And I think speaks to at least a few things that a few conclusions we might draw from it. But it's hilarious how anyone could be shocked that there's a crisis at the border after their conduct, that is Biden's conduct, in the primary and in the general election. I mean, he said he raised his hand with everyone else in the Democratic primary debate about offering full benefits to illegal aliens, including health care and everything else. He's at one point said they should rush the border, or people should be encouraged to rush the border. And then when this crisis when the crisis results from this encouragement of law breaking and a surge at our southern border, the administration acts surprised. Jen Psaki bends over backwards to avoid calling it a crisis. They try to blame it on Trump. And now Biden, when asked, I think last week, or even earlier this week, he basically said what they're going for is to put back in place the policy of the Trump administration, which was to stay in your home country or stay in Mexico or wherever else to press your asylum calls rather than come to the border. And on top of all that, they have this odd, discordant messaging, and it's from Mayorkas, the Homeland Security dude, as well as Biden. And the message is, don't come to the border. We can't, we don't want to admit anyone coming to the border. We have borders. We need you to stay where you are. However, if children come up, we won't turn them away because that's inhumane. So it's just a recipe for endless kids in cages, overcrowding, which we finally saw pictures of, despite their attempt at a media blackout. It's amazing. I mean, it's a media disaster. It's an optics disaster. You only have to conclude that either Biden is really losing it quickly and his former reputation as sort of being a mediocre politician in the just sort of practical sense of reading the national scene and courting constituencies. And that has descended to a new low, it seems to me. They seem committed to lose Congress in the midterms and sort of spend all their political capital very quickly. Extraordinary.
Do you think there is more to it than just the enormous screaming incompetence of Joe Biden and those who surround him? I'm genuinely asking that as a question. One alternative that I, could float is that they're that American politics is so locked into its predetermined scripts that everybody's just kind of relying on their base and then whatever dirty dealings that Democrats are able to come up with, including but not limited to, by the way, importing a ton of votes from South America, which is like obviously on the table, right? Enfranchising, first letting in and then enfranchising a bunch of people under the aegis of humanitarian aid is completely valid as a that's a Democrat strategy.
Yeah.
And I guess I wonder whether Biden maybe thinks he doesn't even have to play politics, rather than that he's just kicking himself in the face, which is what this looks like under any other rubric.
Yeah, the long run politics may be at odds with the short term politics. That's certainly possible. And also there's the press dynamic too, which I think was a little bit unforeseen. It seemed at the beginning they were perfectly happy to indulge the administration on their attempt to really not report on it. At the same time, Trump proved to be correct when he said, when I'm gone, your ratings are going to plummet. So they really, I mean, the media can't let this crisis go to waste because their viewership's down 20 to 30%. Fox is basically in a holding pattern. They're doing what they did before, but CNN and MSNBC's viewership is way down. So in a way, they just are forced, I think, despite their political inclinations, to cover this thing because it's good, compelling television, and you know, they need to rebound from their ratings decline, and the president of the United States, even if he's on your team, is a huge, fat, ripe target.
What about, I mean, kind of like what Spencer was saying, following from that, and I don't necessarily believe this, but what if they're not really worried about losing elections from now on?
Right.
Like, what if, you know, the 2020 playbook is just the new standard? There's going to be mail-in voting, and then, you know, of course, the special election in Georgia that kind of, you know, proved that it can work,
right?
You know, just statewide. You know, mail-in voting, early voting, accept all signatures, harvest all the ballots. I mean, what if this is their plan? And so they're not really concerned about things like whether policies aren't popular.
I mean, this is a good example of when we talk about like stuff that a lot of folks are talking about, but would be radioactive on any other podcast. You know, the sort of the Democrats are never worried about winning in an election again legitimately is something that our friend Michael Anton would make a very serious argument for. But also, and perhaps more saliently, I have heard this from innumerable people who listen to this podcast, who read The American Mind, who are out and about and, you know, reading other conservative websites. I mean, there is a lot of despair about the 600 plus court cases that were fought in the lead up to the 2020 election, many of which tilted in favor of Democrats being able to either fabricate votes or just harvest them. You know, I mean, not all of it has to be like dead people showing up on the voter rolls. A lot of it can be what we were talking about last week, which was the sort of reduction of the democratic process. So just farming people out by the busload, and like convincing them. We've all seen these videos now of the democracy specialists who show up at your old folks' home or wherever, and they just sort of say, "Are you sure that's who you want to vote for?" You know, under the pretense, the sort of thin pretense of coaching people through the democratic process. I mean, I'm with you, Seth. I don't think it's as foregone a conclusion as all that. And I've argued that to people who express this kind of despair a great deal. I think especially in something like the midterm elections, which are just inevitably, even though like people will care about them a lot more than they usually do, I think in 2022, they're just inevitably not as the gigantic media fiasco and firestorm that the 2020 election was, or that any presidential election is. And conservatives are getting smarter about trying to fight these rule changes in the courts. So if they really are relying just on the pure force of the rule bending and rule changing that they've been engaged in, then that's a mistake. I mean, some of these policies, we'll get to talking, I think, about the transgender stuff in a bit, right? I mean, 53% of people at the bare minimum, right, even before you factor in the political affiliation, are in favor of keeping boys sports to boys sports and girls sports to girls sports. You know, I do not think we are in the position where you can just disregard something that has that kind of universal, an issue that has that kind of universal appeal. But I may be wrong. I may not be black-pilled enough.
Well, I mean, let's go back to immigration. I mean, the right is terrible on this issue. It's been terrible on this issue for a long time, which is why we really have this crisis. There was never an effective opposition real until Trump against this kind of illegal and quasi illegal method of just bringing in masses of impoverished people to America. And the fact that the right has lost this debate rhetorically is disgusting. The fact that the right, the Republicans generally have been, said immigration has been a salutary thing for the American working class and the rest of the economy is also disgusting to me. And frankly, if you're out there and you think you're in the middle or you're moderate or whatever, do us all a favor and stop pretending that you think the Democrats or big corporations give two craps about all these migrants who are pawns in their game. Millions of people will come to America and they will be stuck in some difficult situations, and they will be, raped and killed and taken advantage of on their way up here. Why? Because they're pawns in a larger game. Powerful people and powerful interests in the United States want them on that wall, right? They want them coming through that wall, and they do so for the sake of their own power. And, this is it's just terrible. I mean, I was talking to someone who was relaying to me one of the many stories that no one tells, of course, because we don't have a functioning media, about how meatpacking plants are in places you would be very surprised at, right? Are sites where we offload a bunch of these miners. And, if you have people who have to work in order to stay here, who are told they have to work in order to be okay with the law, they're willing to work on the cheap. And it's not just Democratic politicians who support this in line with the companies who use this indentured servitude, right, for the sake of their own power, never mind the Democratic Party. So, take Minnesota is a good example, and I'll just use two publicly known facts. I mean, go look at the Hormel Foundation, same company as Hormel Chili, and ask why they give money to these pro-immigrant groups in Minnesota, where towns have been overwhelmed by people who are impoverished from other countries. Go ask yourself why the meat packers are okay with these people coming in. If you're on the left, you should be ashamed of yourself for allowing this to go on. And you're discredited because you obviously don't care that these people are being, they're basically indentured servants for the sake of corporations that ostensibly you're against. But why is the Democratic Party for this? Well, let's think about Minnesota. Ilhan Omar is in office. Why? Because there's a lot of Somalis in her district. And why are there a lot of Somalis in her district? Well, I'll leave it to the listeners to figure that out. I just think this is an issue that's shameful and it's disgusting. And we need as a people to be able to make the argument that we need to shut down the borders for the sake of working on all the people who are here from all over the world to assimilate our own country to itself and to work and worry about the American worker, our actual neighbors. And enough with the games on the border. It's revolting, frankly.
Well, Matthew, I cannot believe that you would issue these racist dog whistles, these flatly white supremacist tropes that you have about, well, children being raped. I mean, this is how this is going to work, right? And it's exactly what you're saying, that this totally bipartisan, utterly disgusting practice that we have now of importing an underclass, which the neocons like because it drives the price of corn down, and which the liberals like because it gives them all these voters, but which in fact is nothing more than pure exploitation is then presented under the guise, right, in this kind of clown world way, presented under the guise of bleeding heart, openness, we're a nation of immigrants, right? All the while, right, to the detriment also, rhetorically speaking, of middle America, who are treated basically as these like worthless, just takers up of space. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, as we've now talked about before, right, likes to talk about middle America as if they have nothing to contribute to the economy. And what we really need is an infusion of the really industrious people from South America. But of course, all of this, right, we should be able to sweep off the table by simply saying America is a sovereign nation with the right to decide who enters her borders and the right to write laws about that and enforce them. And above that, right, the right to pay attention first to people who are already citizens. So all of this stuff, I agree, right, is a travesty. I think, when coronavirus lockdowns were getting really bad and when I, full disclosure, was going a little bit stir crazy. And I'm not totally sure that I'm yet over just like, and I don't think I'm alone, right? I'm not over the like intensity of how mad those things drove me. But I found myself ranting about restaurant shutdowns, that all of this was for political gain. There's people grandstanding, trying to pretend like they had something to do about coronavirus. Gavin Newsom and the councils like, oh yes, we're following the science. Meanwhile, the person nobody's talking about is the like restaurateur, the small business owner, the waiter who tells you he now has to go on the dole, right? So anyway, this is a long way of saying, I found myself ranting like, the powerful just trample upon the poor. They trample upon the faces of the poor and they eat their flesh. And nobody told me this would happen, as if every word of the Hebrew Bible were not essentially that very thing, right? This is like, we were never warned. And this is the same thing. It's like, this is how immigration debate works. And it's just like the way of the world. I don't know.
No doubt about it. It's the same. And we don't want to, it's the same old story. But that's also why I don't want to hear any more about people saying, "Oh, it's very extreme, your position." I mean, you think that not only are the elites, shameless and acting for their own self-interest, but you think they're actively harming the rest of America and inflicting pain on them for the sake of their own gain, and saying, in fact, that they are morally right and anyone who opposes them is evil as they destroy unjustly these businesses. And you're right. That is the way of the world. That is evil. That is the way power corrupts. But at the same time, apparently, we do need to give this message out, because there are a hell of a lot of people in both parties who don't want to acknowledge that we have people in charge who, whether a lot of them are useful idiots, no doubt about it. People you could hire useful idiots from the universities, put them in nonprofits, and have them, I care about these people who are coming here, and probably some of them do. But who are they working for? They're working for people who know damn well what they're doing. And what they are doing is driving the cost of labor down and subsidizing. For conservatives of the right to support this is disgusting too, especially, right? Because the government, in effect, when you bring in illegal or quasi-illegal labor or vulnerable populations to the United States, what you're doing is, in these communities, is you're having government subsidized, right? Everyone is going to suffer. Middle America is not only not going to get the jobs, not only are their prices, their salaries going to go down, but also their resources and taxation is all going to support, right, people who have to learn how to speak the language. The kids are suffering in school. And what are we doing? We're subsidizing these people to come here and work as indentured servants for the sake of bigger corporations and the Democratic Party, because it gives them power. So we can have people like Ilhan Omar, go into Congress and tell us how the rest of the world, we're all evil and America's evil. It boggles the mind that it's allowed. And what's so frustrating is that, Trump just scratched the surface of this, really. I mean, and America knows it. The farmers know it. People know that this is what's going on. It's just been for so long, you can't say it out loud. And I really blame a lot of leadership on the right for that.
What I think is really interesting about this question is that this is what got Trump elected. This is the question that has been, bubbling up under the surface among, a lot of people for years, decades. That has gone completely unspoken at the top. The last politician who really brought this up was Barbara Jordan, who Clinton, the Houston congresswoman, whom Bill Clinton appointed to lead a commission on immigration reform. And she came out and said, yes, Black Americans suffer from the introduction of illegal labor, and so forth. She basically stated points that sound like they come from VDARE. Unfortunately, she died. So this was really what elevated Trump. I had always thought, I talked to friends in politics well before Trump came on, if any politician who seized this issue would automatically get 10 electoral points because it's so hot and it's just totally, it was something that the major parties wouldn't touch. But what's amazing is, so Trump seized the issue, he won, but that's also was his undoing. If Trump were somehow won without touching immigration, does anyone doubt that he would have been acceptable to both sides? I get the feeling, I don't think the Democrats would have responded the way they did. And I don't think that his haters on the right would have responded that way either. So that's why about halfway through, when Trump was first elected, I thought, well, this is great. We're finally going to get a pro-American immigration policy. And gradually I saw, oh, no, this is like the third rail plus the nuclear trigger plus, whatever other metaphor you want to add in there of American politics. This is the thing that everybody's in agreement on, that we do not mess with, for various reasons. So it's interesting. I don't know exactly where we go with this. It's been tried.
Well, Seth, I wonder whether this point doesn't bring us exactly back to answering Ryan's question from the beginning. I mean, it's an extreme, really, when you think about it, a staggering disconnect between the issues that are popular with a majority of American voters, the things that most Americans want to see done and will elect people to do, and the things that are politically expedient in the sense of playing well in the press, right? That like you will, the closer you get to the action item that is on everybody's wish list, the more you become like public enemy number one in the eyes of certain people with very big microphones and a lot of dollars. And I think that's not just true in immigration, although immigration is probably the starkest example of that contrast, but the transgender thing too, right? That like everybody wants boys playing boy sports and girls playing girl sports. And yet to say so turns you into this like cretinous villain in the public portrayal. I mean, I think like if we go anywhere with this, it's to build more institutions that can put out a different narrative, and then to like foster a healthy disregard for this just completely disconnected narrative that portrays doing what the American people want as the height of villainy.
Mm-hmm. It's a weird sort of third rail, right? Originally, that saying was reserved especially for entitlements and especially Social Security, as George W. Bush found out in his second term. But that was the third rail because even a lot of, conservatives and Tea Partiers of a certain age say, don't touch my Social Security. So it's a broadly popular program, whatever constitutional problems it's had since the New Deal, which, we've largely just, at this point, in Madison's terms, we've kind of liquidated that constitutional question. I don't think no court would overturn Social Security these days, and no politician would run on it being unconstitutional. But this, immigration thing is like Seth says, it's interesting. And Spencer echoed. It's sort of broadly the notion that we ought to do something about it and that we ought to have borders was until fairly recently a pretty popular proposition, and especially a popular proposition on the right. Interestingly, I don't know, you guys have seen this probably here and there, but the support for more immigration has gone up in the last 10 years, I think, on both sides of the political aisle, despite Trump being able to capitalize it on the right. So that's pretty interesting as well. Although, but who knows? I mean, who knows what the swing back the other way will be, given the current crisis at the border, which I think the Biden administration, for a variety of political reasons, is incapable of really solving this problem. So this just has to continue. And I don't know, how can they even fix it, given their current political coalition and the kind of correlation of forces at the top of American society, which, let's be honest, as we've talked about many times, institutionally is mostly held by the left.
So what happens, right? I mean, what happens given that, in a way, this is what makes the anger against Trump so hard-edged. Maybe not the only thing, but it certainly is one of them. So what happens next? And isn't a big part of it, Ryan, whether or not leaders on the right are able to find a way to talk about something that so much of the country cares about, an issue that so many people see the injustice of, or whether they continue to do what they have done, in which case, I don't know. I'd say it's over. It's over for the Republicans if they can't find a way to keep talking about this issue, which and utterly reject this racist moniker because they do so. And then I kind of feel as if then I don't even want them to exist anymore.
Yeah, that's fair. I suspect. Well, I think for matters of political self-interest as well as the sort of tectonic shift that Trump initiated in the party, I think they're going to have to adapt themselves to this new reality. Plus, and on top of everything else, I mean, we're going to have. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't have basically 3 years worth of more, a kind of low boil camp of the saints at our southern border. I mean, I don't know, this controversial novel, which some of you may know about, envisioned a fictional France where basically they had a huge influx. It's South Asian Muslims? I forget exactly the.
Yeah, it's like India.
Yeah,
all the Indians.
Yeah, everyone comes to Europe, and this will happen in Europe because Africa is growing exponentially and Europe is dying off. So that this sort of Eurafrica question will loom large as well. And this is the global South moving north. It's not just in the U.S. It's something that's going to fuel our politics for many years to come, and is fueling the rise of populism and nationalism in Europe and is in the United States as well. So, no, I think the right, if it's going to have any sort of chance, Matt, is going to have to assimilate this new reality and this new rhetoric, and we hope some decent, humane, but nonetheless kind of sovereignty-centered policy from the right. There's a Politico piece, I think, maybe today. A few of us traded it. I just sort of skimmed it, but a bunch of Mark Meadows and others are gathering in Palm Beach to sort of gin up a large treasure chest of money to basically back Trumpist policies and Trumpist candidates. I think a big piece of that push will have to be this new stance on immigration, which the base of the Republican Party has had since at least the 80s in various forms, but has just been consistently betrayed by its leaders. And so I think Trump's realignment of the party around the basket of policies that he advanced, namely, sort of pro-sovereignty, anti-open borders, fewer foreign adventures and forever wars, and then a trade policy that looks after the middle class rather than the abstract, accumulation of plus 4 GDP points, the middle class be damned. I would hope that this new energy on the right and it looks to be a lot of money on the right would channel all these things to the good.
Well, as Seth says, it's just a bucket of votes that's sitting there, and I think our pal and one of the co-founders of American Moment, Nick Solheim, has pointed out that the minute the right wants to start winning elections again, an economically centrist, socially conservative platform is where everybody lives. It's where all the votes are, what people are waiting for. And yeah, it's crazy to me that there exists no statesman in American politics with the stones just to pick up that bucket of votes because somebody's going to, like some mean guy is going to call him nasty names online. I mean, I recognize that that's a way that a lot of Americans are currently being conditioned to do business and make personal decisions. But are there no men left yet in Middle Earth? The line of Gondor and Rohan is not fully spent. Ron DeSantis exists. Come on, people. We can do this. I don't know.
Yeah. Sorry, forgive me, Spencer, for drawing this analogy, but whenever I hear Lord of the Rings, now I just think of David French for some reason. That's unfair.
Oh no! Does he also make?
No, it's actually more Game of Thrones. I'm just thinking.
Okay.
I'm just thinking of his gaming chair, which he advertised on Twitter, which had a House Stark stencil on it.
Yes,
baffling all the boomers who are a large part of his audience, and then also inducing sort of a cringe-induced backing away from many people.
Gaming chairs aren't good. Like, there's this whole thing where you get like the best gaming chair that costs a ton of money. Like, they're worse than just office chairs. I'm going to make people mad by saying that, but I don't know. Like, the French tweet was sort of like, yeah, I don't know that any people actually enjoy sitting in those chairs. But I just rewatched they released this recolorized Lord of the Rings because Peter Jackson always wished he had gotten the color a little bit different, and it is actually kind of cool. And I just rewatched the whole thing, which is why all my references are no longer to Star Trek and now to Lord of the Rings.
No, it's what's close at hand to your brain. Interesting, recolorized. So just as an aside, if anyone has not watched Peter Jackson's, what was the movie called? The one where he recolorized World War I footage.
Yeah, that was called. I actually saw it in the theater. It's like an odd name.
Yeah, it was over Christmas a couple years ago or 3 years ago, right? Anyway, check it out. If you Google it, Peter Jackson colorized World War I, you'll find it. It's extraordinary. Well, speaking of immigrants, I want to talk quickly about this horrible Colorado shooting.
Sorry, just to jump in here. It's called They Shall Not Grow Old.
They Shall Not Grow Old.
Right.
There you go.
Thank you, Jake.
As we that are left grow old.
One of the extraordinary pieces of it is like you see a lot of these British kids who enlisted, and a lot of their stories are, they were 15 and were kind of big for their age and could enlist. And, a kid was 16 or 17 and he kind of tepidly presented his birth certificate, but the guy said, we'll just write down that you're 18 and don't show anyone that, that kind of thing. But, imagine going to World War I. Imagine being in trench warfare when you're 16. I can't imagine it. Can't even begin to. This Colorado shooting, which happened at it has some weird name, Superfoo or whatever. It was a grocery store. I don't want to make light of it, but it turns out that the shooter was named Ahmad al-Issa, and he was a Syrian refugee of the Obama years. So it just adds fuel to this immigration and asylum fire. Of course, it was horrible. I think he shot, I don't know if he killed 10 people, but he certainly injured 10 people.
Killed 10.
He killed 10. Thank you, Jake. The narrative, of course, from left-wing Twitter and even left-of-center Twitter, or just racially obsessed, identity politics obsessed Twitter was, along the lines of suspect gets captured alive and walked out. Oh, of course he's white. I'm so sick of white people shooting us up. White men are the biggest terrorist threat in America, et cetera, et cetera. And then even some folks who clearly saw the picture of him getting escorted out in handcuffs and, from far. I don't even want to grant the premises of these categories, but he looks white from the shot, 20 feet away. He's just a kind of hairy 21-year-old with thinning hair and looks kind of swarthy. But other than that, he looks like a white dude. It quickly turned out later, of course, no, he's a Muslim American. Well, not even American. I don't know if he has citizenship or not, but a Muslim guy who is sort of left-wing, hated Trump. The narrative collapsed. So the fallback position, and this is still being held, of course, on woke and media adjacent Twitter, and just sort of Twitter adjacent media. Both those things blend together. The line now is, well, factually he's white, or factually he's not white, but spiritually he's white, or something along those lines. Meaning, and this has been a theme we've taken up before, which is to say, white supremacy invades all manner of behavior, no matter if you're white or not. We saw this a week or two ago with the rise of marches against white supremacy because of the rise of anti-Asian violence, which, if you look at the stats, has mostly been due to Black on Asian violence. But nonetheless, it's all white supremacy. So a terrible thing in Boulder. I hope anyone whose family, immediate or extended group, was affected, they have our sympathies. It's a terrible thing. But the media reaction to it was just another indication of the descent of our elite lefties into some kind of, I don't know what you'd call it. It's kind of a psychosis or paranoid delusion. It's really remarkable.
Well, what I really think that's almost salutary about this is that in the same way that fascism as a category collapsed to just mean like whatever the left doesn't like. Well, clearly white supremacy has now collapsed into, I mean, if white supremacy should be evident as to what it is, like white people killing non-white people or, you know, trying to suppress them. Right. But once you start saying, no, white supremacy is an incubus that works within people's minds, like spooky action that can be imposed on people. So even like black people can be enacting white supremacy when they beat up an Asian person,
right? Or
black people can kill when they kill each. So now it just becomes whatever I don't like is white supremacy. Well, I mean, it just becomes like a tautology, and so the whole thing collapses unless you're really willing to invest enough energy into, you know, keeping these walls from closing in on each other. I think most people see it as silly. And so the more that these categories become mocked, I think is good. At the same time, the whole thing is just perverse. That now you have like congresswomen like Ilhan Omar talking about, well, exactly what you said. Well, he appears white.
Yeah.
So in this context, he would be white. If he were the victim, of course, it would be an Islamophobic attack upon him. So I don't really know where we're headed with this. Obviously, they just turned it into, look, if it's a white person doing it, then the problem is white supremacy. If it's not, then the problem is guns. So we're back to this again.
Well, this is a strategy, Seth, which is like pretty explicit in its Stalinist history. There's a really good, decently long, but worth the read essay in Claremont Review books called The Original Fascist, which is about Mussolini. It's by the original edgelord, as Maggi calls him, Angelo Codevilla, who wrote an assessment of Mussolini and of the concept of fascism generally. And he points out near the end that first under Stalin and then kind of popularized by Theodor Adorno in The Authoritarian Personality, there was this like tactic of defining fascism as like everything that could be considered to the right and making it sufficiently plastic to be able to identify in your opponents no matter what, right? So things like conventionalism, I'm quoting here from the book, conventionalism, authoritarian submission, authoritarian aggression, anti-interception, the rejection of all inwardness, superstition and stereotypy, power and toughness, destructiveness and cynicism, projectivity and excessive sex, right? So this is like, you bundle all of those things under fascism, which is still being done. And then you just can call anybody a fascist. And then the public imagination kind of associates just all the worst nasties. You're absolutely right that white supremacy, and I would even go further and say whiteness as a category is now being shunted into this role. And it seems to me as if there's one of two ways that can go. One is that whiteness as a category, it seems quite potent to me, right? Racial tribalism is a very powerful force in the human psyche. It's deep seated and it's more kind of primal than a lot of our like sort of modernist liberal assumptions and mores. You associate all of these like big bads with one race and then like find ways to kind of narrativize every event into that thesis. I don't know, you can generate a panic, some of the really ugliest stuff that's possible, but you can also make yourself look so absurd that nobody will go with you, which I hope, Seth, you're right. That's like where we're headed here. But it does seem to me as if all of us, especially the left, but maybe that's just from the outside, right? We are all of us now in this compulsive behaviors of narrative formation that an event happens, a human tragedy, an irreducible human tragedy, like the taking of innocent life at random by a psychopath, which fits like into a lot of actually real things that are going on nationally, like, as someone pointed out, the fact that the US just bombed Syria, and maybe that has something to do with like radicalization and the way that like Islamist extremism manifests in like lone wolf shootings, all this stuff, right? But like, even leaving that aside, it's just like this event happens. There, 5 damn seconds for the people involved to grieve would be appreciated before we just like knee-jerk kick into this thing where, oh, it's about white supremacy. If it's not about white supremacy, then it's about guns. I mean, this is not, at this point, I'm not making an original point. It's just like the way that our news cycle works now. And one does hope that it will drive itself to such a point of absurdism that the people will simply reject it and be disgusted with it. Although one can wait a very long time for cognitive dissonance of that kind to manifest itself in the minds of your average American.
Don't we think, though, that, I mean, this is one of those problems where you can wait a long time because the Soviets are in charge, right? And it's a fallacy. Certainly what you're saying is right. It's a fallacy to think, well, there's going to be a backlash for sure, and it's so ridiculous, it'll change. It doesn't have to change. It can remain pretty bad for a long period of time, proven over and over again in human history. But I guess we can at least say in this podcast that, I mean, it is absurd. The stuff we're talking about is insane. And I don't think it's naive to say most Americans actually don't agree with this kind of stuff, and it makes them sick as well. So Americans might be divided on an issue like immigration, although Trump's position is far more popular than anyone wants to admit. But on this stuff, where you're talking about the whiteness and the spiritual whiteness, and you're politicizing a tragedy right away, it's just revolting. And I think most people have had it up to here with the woke cultural revolution. We should say you can even see, right, the potato on CNN, Stelter, making these overtures against the wokeness, as if all of a sudden CNN is appalled by some of this cancel culture. But in this case, I mean, it's hard to. I think that the demoralization is the point, as some wise people have been saying for a while. And I think it's more of, you just look at it and turn away in disgust. If there's nothing to discuss here, these people online are all crazy. They're talking about a horrible tragedy in strange terms that make no sense. And I mean, everything about the kind of concept of race that they have, this is all just some kind of sick, mind game. And I mean, the truth of the matter, as far as I can make out, right, we know this guy. He was a Syrian Muslim, right? Mm-hmm. And we also, I've heard people say today, I don't know if it's confirmed, that he was probably going after Jews who were at the store. Is that right?
I hadn't heard that.
I have heard people say today, I don't know if it was publicly or privately, so I don't know if it's, I have no idea if it's confirmed or not. I think it was privately. People were saying that they thought, since there was a Jewish population who went to the store, that he may have been anti-Semitic, right? Whatever. We don't know yet. But that sounds more reasonable given the facts we do know than this other stuff. I mean, I think the problem is, and I really think this is true for all sides, I think the majority of Americans, they don't like thinking about people this way. They don't like talking about people this way. It makes them uncomfortable, and they just don't sit around. They don't have the time to sit around and be obsessed with race or color or whatever you want to call it in the way these people online are. I think this over and over again. And normal people of whatever color or background in America do not sit around and obsess about race in the way that these people do. But that may not matter because the people in charge are in charge, and they will persecute anyone who disagrees.
One thing, I whenever I hear this thing that, this theme that, he was white because they arrested him and he wasn't killed. So I said, somebody was saying this. I said, oh yeah, and that's why there's no black people in prison, right? Because they're all killed. Yeah. People don't like that.
No, I'm sure they don't, Seth. I'm sure they don't. No, it's just part of the larger absurd information op that's going on. Well, let's close out with a more uplifting topic. Question mark, which is
that bodes well. Right?
It was a low bar after our insane racialist response to this tragedy in Colorado. But just wanted to talk a bit about some domestic politics, and especially what we thought was a rising star in domestic politics after she handled COVID, and that's Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota. There was a bill working its way through the legislature, made it past the Senate, which a lot of these don't. I read from our friend John Schweppe, who's covered this well on his Substack. I encourage you all to check out John's piece. I forget the title of it, but if you Google John Schweppe, last name SCHWEPPE, John with no H, and then just put in Substack, it will come up. He works for the American Principles Project, which is an interesting think tank in C4 in Washington. And John sort of lays out how this all played out. It made it through the Senate like a lot of these bills don't. Then Kristi Noem kind of went dark for a week or 10 days, started soliciting comment from the Chamber of Commerce and others. It's been reported that she was advised, well, she said, and then it's also been reported in other ways that she was advised by conservative legal scholars and attorneys that this was going to be a loser in federal court. So she issued what's it called? It's like a style and form veto, and sent back the bill with a couple of its provisions gutted, including the cause for action provision, allowing girls to sue, and really removing the part of it that would protect college sports, or really removed the substantive, toothsome parts of it that would have protect college athletics from suffering the indignity of having men who claim to be women competing against women. And I suppose I should say, and vice versa, but mostly it happens that way, not the other way, for obvious reasons of biology and strength and all the rest. So anyway, our friend Henry Olson, who has a weekly column, might be more often than that actually, in the Washington Post, wrote the gist of his piece was Kristi Noem really misreads the room politically on the right. We have friends wondering whether this is sort of the end of her national political career. It's probably a little too premature for that, but this one's really going to hurt her. And the basic line is that for both kind of conventional legal establishment on the right reasons of her losing in court if she were to sign this, and then also what looks to be pressure from business interests, both in the state and by interstate entities like Amazon, she caved. And her defense of it has been defensive, to say the least, and not that articulate. She went on Tucker Carlson and did not acquit herself very well, offering kind of blustery pushback rather than a real explanation or a real sufficient ability to debate and sort of be nimble on her feet in the light of what should have been pretty obvious criticism that was going to come over this issue that's roiling the right and is concerning a lot of Americans, not even on the right, as our identity politics obsessed left continues to push the envelope with trans rights and everything else. I was a little surprised, actually, quite surprised by this. I should add one last thing. I read just before we came on the podcast, I just saw the headline, which was Kristi Noem floats decriminalizing marijuana in South Dakota. So I was joking with Spencer off air that, it's like someone on fire saying, please, would you hand me that gas can? I think I need a little more fuel. Just in the terms of the cultural ferment and energy on the right and in the Republican Party, it seems like drug legalization and the gutting of anti-trans bills that protect girls' sports. I don't know quite what political hand Kristi Noem thinks she's playing.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised that Noem made the decision she made. I was surprised at how poorly she managed it as an optics issue and as a just moment under the attention of the media. And Ryan, you and I were talking about this on the Substack podcast, so I'll repeat myself a little bit, but I'm being the peanut gallery here, admittedly, but I'm watching her go on Tucker, and she has got a totally workable angle in my opinion, on this, which is, look, I am trying to work this out in the context of my state. I want a law that's going to work and not get struck down in court. And at the same time, unfairly, I have to adjudicate this as a national optics issue, as if I were already running for president. She kind of fumbled all of that. And again, it's like, it's already a bad move. You know, she took bad advice. She flubbed, you know, she went back on stuff that she had said previously. She flubbed all of this stuff. But like, she's obviously, as I think, Ryan, you said to me, she's obviously not ready for prime time. Like she has a real problem kind of just handling herself under public scrutiny. I think on some level, she's been kind of a darling of conservative media for a while because she's been one of the better governors when it comes to lockdowns and coronavirus. But look, ultimately, the issue itself does kind of play up this very high stakes situation in which the public, the people that would be potentially voting for her for president, and certainly her constituents in South Dakota, would rather see her fight a court case and lose because they believe that the court precedent under which this thing falls is illegitimate and anti-human. I mean, Bostock, which folds Title IX, which folds transgenderism into Title IX, and therefore basically enshrines a completely bonkers understanding of just natural human biology and gender that's not intuitive to anybody but the most devoted radical activists, right? Creates this situation in which the courts are like enemies of just basic laws that any sort of free-thinking populace should want to write, and the people are hungry to see like big stands taken against that set of court precedents, which is like a regime level situation, as we are constantly saying, right? That's a crisis of the first magnitude when your constituents, what they want you to do is go up and potentially lose against what should be like the highest authority. You know, not that the court should be the highest authority in the land, but that the regime should be the kind of like context within which we all operate. What they really want is to see Noem fight against the regime. And like, that's a big development.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, doesn't the left always try to fight these test cases that they know they're going to lose so they can push them further? I thought that's a strategy, and like one that kind of makes sense. I mean, if she lost, then they could take it to a higher court. Like, what's wrong with that? It seems very odd.
Yeah, it furthers Anton's wonderful analogy from the Flight 93 election, which is that the Republicans are the Washington Generals of national politics. And this just seems like another example. Yeah, why not make I mean, this is the thing too. And it's one of many, many, many examples of the Republicans, and especially the legal establishment on the Republican right, of basically they're all judicial supremacists. Ultimately, courts decide these things. Bostock, which the ink is barely dry on, is now the law of the land, and there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas no, the left never treats. They're just much better at politics. They never treat any of these issues that are, I mean, they could be settled for decades, let alone a year, and they'd fight tooth and nail and try to marshal a political coalition on their side, try to make a political issue out of it. It's just, so in a certain way, it's partly Noem's failure of imagination and failure of political courage, but it's a very hard thing to unlearn this tendency on the right to kind of just, stay one step behind the constant, perpetual ratchet effect of the left's cultural and political war, rather than to go for real wins and go for real aggression on behalf of your constituents and real political activity, rather than just operating within the Overton window set by your political enemies or political rivals anyway. It's maddening. And I thought better of her.
Well, I mean, look, the gutting of obscenity law in this country was basically undertaken precisely by totally fabricated court cases. I mean, even cases in which the result is one that I am ultimately sympathetic toward, like the Ulysses case, right? This was James Joyce's Ulysses, has some pretty scandalous material in it, and so it was like banned from publication. And like they purposefully shipped copies of it so that they would bring this issue to court and be able to fight this thing out. The EOC, the Equal Opportunity, the EOOC, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, as Helen Andrews and Chris Caldwell are both fond of pointing out, right? Like went into rural communities looking for cases that they could bring on the new civil rights law since from 1964 onward, and this is like a part of how we do politics. It's not as if these things are set in stone forever. Precedent is overturned all the time. That part of it seems perfectly valid and legitimate. I can still see why Noem, I can see why she would have gotten wrapped up in the council of people who were advising her in the wrong direction. And I don't think this rules her out for me as a politician who would ever be worth watching exactly. But it certainly rules her out for me as somebody I'm excited about as a presidential candidate. It's obviously like a kind of a rookie mistake.
Yeah, part of the problem, we should say, right, is that, we can be real about this. A lot of politicians are basically symbols. So, hate to break your bubble if you're listening, but a lot of them just really do listen to what people around them say and have much less agency than, than the stars are supposed to have. There's a lot of talking heads all around. So, it's a question of who to blame. At the very least, you have to blame her instincts in some way. But it's pretty normal for red state politicians to be guided in this terrible way by their advisors, because the Republican Party is full of people, especially in complacent red states, where the voters are much, much, much better than their leaders and understand, if they understood fully what was going on in their state, they'd be very upset about it. And, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if there are some other issues, including immigration and labor and so forth, where maybe she's not so good as well. The whole siren song of this form of republicanism has been, these people who pay lip service to certain principles, but in reality, in the Midwest, in Texas and other places, they're really just pretending to do work, and they don't really they haven't really internalized what the base thinks or the real debate that's going on in America that's serious. And I think our frustration, Ryan's frustration, just he's echoing. We're all frustrated because we want people who actually understand what the issues are, take them seriously, and try to engage in political warfare accordingly. And the fact of the matter is that that's a tall order. That's a high bar for a lot of the Republican Party, and we still have lots of work to do to even get to the place where we have leaders who understand the landscape and are willing to fight about it. And frankly, I don't really see it changing anytime soon. I want to accelerate this change through especially media shaming the right people, trying to create prominent examples who lead a way forward. But when you look at the institutions we have and a lot of the parties, the state parties, there's a lot of work to be done. A lot.
Yeah. Well, I want to end on a positive note, which is we should toot our own horn just a bit. But our friend Scott Yenner, Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life in Washington, D.C. Scott, his day job is at Boise State University, and he and we partnered with a local think tank, I think the Idaho Freedom Center, but I could be wrong about that. So we published in conjunction with them and at Scott and his co-authors' good work, just sort of a catalog at Boise State University in Iowa of their racial justice, sort of critical race theory stuff that they teach. Scott's premise forever in Idaho has been, a lot of these state legislators and legislatures are kind of clueless about this stuff. They sort of get sold a bill of goods by their universities and by administration at the universities with sort of obfuscating language and mealy-mouthed stuff, and they're assured that this is just part of core curriculum. They're really not teaching quite the slate of pernicious things that are claimed. Whereas what Scott's been doing in Idaho is just presenting to the legislature, no, this is in fact what they're teaching. Here are the course titles. Here are the assigned readings. Here's the lack of sort of scholarly rigor and just the ideological nature of this whole venture. And the Idaho State Legislature has defunded, I forget quite how much initially, but they're planning on doing it up to the tune of $10 million, defunded Boise State University. They've had to wait to defund at that higher level because they've got a COVID lockdown or COVID outbreak problem. So they had to shut down their small legislature for a certain amount of time. But this is one of the things that we're working on at Claremont, which is to sort of explain in a more cogent way to state legislators and policymakers the ways in which they can fight back, especially on these issues of classic state power, police powers, health, safety, and morals, including education stuff, where the feds can't, or the feds have a much more constrained sphere of operation. So Idaho is a place to start. We want to take this show on the road. And maybe we'll be lucky enough to get in front of Governor Noem and see what her concerns were about this bill and help make her a more effective politician, because we should end by singing her praises. She showed a great amount of courage during the whole COVID business. She's an attractive politician and one who's certainly ambitious and no dummy. So here's to hoping she can get better, and groups like Claremont can help make folks at the state level learn how to deal with this new landscape more effectively and in a more politically aggressive and responsible manner, kind of in the old sense of politics. That is to say, in the sense in which Trump understood instinctually, which was to run on things that make sense to voters, unencumbered by the normal bureaucraties and legalese of the establishment and professional classes, and to make it a direct appeal to a national or a state-based electorate, to run on the promises you make to that electorate, and then to try to do those things. That's how politics used to work. Unfortunately, we have about a century of a bureaucracy and administrative state grown up, and then this peculiar notion that the courts have the final say on all things constitutional. We need to break both those things at the very least if we're going to have any success. Well, we're out of time. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and the brand new and just mentioned Washington, D.C. based Center for the American Way of Life, dc.claremont.org. Please rate us well. Please rate us well. 5 stars. It helps spread the word. Share and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. I should one last shout out. If anyone's going to be at Philly Sock this weekend, Matt Peterson, James Pullis, and yours truly will be there. Matt's speaking on Sunday. Our colleague Charles Kessler is speaking Friday night. So keep an eye out for us and come say hi. If you're going to be there, we'll be in the great city of Fort Worth, Texas. With all that, thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.